Most people think they know the Great Depression, stock market crash, red lines, Dust Bowl, recovery through the New Deal. But what if almost everything you learned in school was incomplete? What if the real story reveals uncomfortable truths about how modern economies actually work? Truths that challenge the narratives we tell ourselves today. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic catastrophe. It was a systematic failure that exposed the fragility of an entire civilization's assumptions about prosperity, progress, and the role of government. And the most disturbing part? Many of the same vulnerabilities exist in our economic system right now. This is the story they don't teach you in school. The 1920s are remembered as a golden age. Jazz music filled nightclubs. Flappers danced. Henry Ford's assembly lines churned out automobiles at unprecedented rates. Stock prices climbed higher and higher. America seemed invincible. But beneath the glittering surface, the American economy was fundamentally unstable. And the warning signs were everywhere, if anyone had cared to look. First, income inequality had reached staggering levels. By 1929, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned over 40% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 93% saw their share of national income actually decline during the decade. This concentration of wealth created a consumption problem that few economists recognized at the time. When the wealthy accumulate more money, they don't spend proportionally more on consumer goods. A millionaire doesn't buy 10,000 loaves of bread just because he can afford them. This means that as wealth concentrates at the top, overall consumer demand weakens. The economy becomes dependent on continued investment and speculation rather than sustainable consumption. Second, the agricultural sector was already in crisis throughout the 1920s. While urban America prospered, rural America suffered. World War I had encouraged farmers to expand production dramatically. They borrowed heavily to buy more land and equipment. When European agriculture recovered after the war, American farmers faced collapsing prices with massive debts. Farm income dropped by over 50% between 1920 and 1929. Thousands of rural banks failed. But because agriculture represented a smaller portion of GDP than manufacturing, policymakers largely ignored this warning sign. They assumed the industrial economy could thrive independently of agricultural health. They were wrong. Third, the banking system was inherently unstable. America had thousands of small, independent banks with no federal deposit insurance. When rumors spread about a bank's solvency, depositors would rush to withdraw their money. This created self-fulfilling prophecies. Even healthy banks could collapse if enough depositors panicked simultaneously. Between 1921 and 1929, over 5,000 banks failed. Most were small rural institutions affected by agricultural distress. But each failure eroded confidence in the banking system. Each failure meant destroyed savings and reduced lending capacity. The financial infrastructure was quietly crumbling. Fourth, international debt structures were unsustainable. Germany owed massive reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France owed massive debts to the United States. The only way this system functioned was through American loans to Germany. Germany used these loans to pay reparations. Britain and France used these reparations to pay American debts. It was a circular flow that depended entirely on continued American lending. The moment American capital stopped flowing to Europe, the entire structure would collapse. And American capital was flowing primarily because of stock market speculation, not sound economic fundamentals. Finally, the stock market itself had become detached from reality. Stock prices bore little relationship to actual corporate earnings. Investors bought stocks not because companies were fundamentally sound, but because they expected prices to keep rising. This is the definition of a speculative bubble. Worse, the bubble was inflated by massive amounts of borrowed money. Investors could buy stocks on margin, putting down only 10% of the purchase price. If you had $1,000, you could control $10,000 worth of stock. When prices rose, your returns were multiplied tenfold. But when prices fell, your losses were equally catastrophic. By 1929, margin loans totaled nearly $9 billion. To put this in perspective, the entire federal budget that year was just over $3 billion. The stock market had become a giant casino built on credit, and nobody seemed concerned. October 24, 1929. Black Thursday, the day the music stopped. Stock prices had peaked in September. Through early October, they drifted downward. Nothing dramatic. just a slight correction that many investors viewed as a buying opportunity. Then came Thursday, October 24th. Prices began falling rapidly at the opening bell. By mid-morning, panic had set in. Investors flooded the market with sell orders. Prices collapsed. Margin calls went out by the thousands. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks were forced to sell immediately to cover their debts. This selling pushed prices down further, triggering more margin calls, creating a death spiral. Leading bankers attempted to stabilize the market by publicly buying stocks. This worked temporarily. Prices recovered somewhat. Many believed the worst was over. They were catastrophically wrong. The following Tuesday, October 29th, became known as Black Tuesday. Over 16 million shares traded hands, a record that would stand for decades. Prices collapsed even faster than Thursday. By the end of the day, investors had lost billions of dollars in paper wealth. The banking consortium attempting to support prices gave up. There was nothing more they could do. But here's what most accounts miss. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression. It was a symptom of deeper structural problems. If the crash had occurred in a healthy economy, recovery would have been swift. Instead, the crash exposed and accelerated fundamental weaknesses. The crash destroyed confidence. Consumers who felt wealthy in September suddenly felt poor in November. They stopped spending. Businesses saw sales decline and laid off workers. Unemployed workers stopped spending entirely. This created a downward spiral of declining demand and rising unemployment. The crash also destroyed the international lending system. American investors, having lost fortunes in the stock market, stopped lending to Germany. Without American loans, Germany couldn't pay reparations. Without reparations, Britain and France couldn't pay American debts. The circular flow collapsed. International trade began contracting. Banks that had lent heavily to stock market speculators suddenly faced massive losses. Many had purchased stocks themselves. As prices fell and loans went bad, banks became insolvent. Depositors, hearing rumors of bank troubles, rushed to withdraw their money. More banks failed. Each failure destroyed more savings and reduced lending capacity further. By the end of 1930, over 1,300 banks had collapsed. And this was just the beginning. The conventional narrative suggests that the Great Depression happened despite government efforts to fix it. The truth is more disturbing. Government policy actively made the depression deeper and longer than it needed to be. Start with the Federal Reserve. The Fed had been created in 1913 specifically to prevent financial panics by acting as a lender of last resort. When banks faced temporary liquidity problems, the Fed was supposed to provide emergency loans. This would prevent bank runs and maintain stability. Instead, the Fed did the opposite. As banks collapsed throughout 1930 and 1931, the Fed raised interest rates and reduced the money supply. They were obsessed with maintaining the gold standard and preventing inflation. They seemed oblivious to the deflationary death spiral engulfing the economy. Between 1929 and 1933, the money supply contracted by approximately one-third. This was monetary policy malpractice on a historic scale. As money became scarcer, prices fell. As prices fell, the real burden of debts increased. Farmers who had borrowed when wheat cost $1 per bushel now had to repay those debts when wheat cost 30 cents per bushel. Default rates skyrocketed. Businesses faced the same problem. Even profitable companies struggled to service debts as prices collapsed. This led to more bankruptcies and layoffs. Unemployed workers couldn't pay their own debts. More banks failed. The Federal Reserve, watching this catastrophe unfold, continued contractionary policies. Then came the tariff disaster. In 1930, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising import duties to historically high levels. The stated goal was protecting American jobs by making foreign goods more expensive. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition urging President Hoover to veto the bill. He signed it anyway. The result was predictable. Other countries immediately imposed retaliatory tariffs. International trade collapsed. American exports fell by over 60% between 1929 and 1932. Industries dependent on exports laid off millions of workers. The tariff, intended to protect American jobs, destroyed them instead. Meanwhile, President Hoover clung to outdated economic theories. He believed in balanced budgets above all else. As tax revenues collapsed during the Depression, Hoover raised tax rates dramatically to balance the budget. The top marginal income tax rate increased from 25% to 63% between 1931 and 1932. This was exactly the wrong policy. In a depression, when private spending collapses, government should increase spending to compensate. Instead, higher taxes further reduced private spending, while Hoover cut government spending to maintain budget balance. This deepened the economic contraction. Hoover also believed that direct government relief would undermine American character. He insisted that private charity and local governments should handle relief efforts. But private charity was overwhelmed. State and local governments went bankrupt trying to provide relief. Millions of Americans suffered needlessly because of ideological rigidity. By 1933, 25% of American workers were unemployed. In some cities, the rate exceeded 40%. But these statistics barely capture the human reality. Unemployment didn't just mean lost income. It meant lost identity and purpose. Men who had supported families suddenly couldn't provide. The psychological trauma was immense. Suicide rates increased dramatically. Marriages collapsed. Birth rates plummeted as couples delayed having children they couldn't afford. Those who kept jobs often faced severe wage cuts. Real wages fell by over 20% between 1929 and 1933. But because prices fell even faster, real purchasing power actually increased slightly for employed workers. This created a divide between those with secure jobs, who were relatively comfortable, and the unemployed masses living in desperate poverty. Hunger became widespread. Bread lines stretched for blocks in every major city. Private charities struggled to meet demand. Malnutrition-related diseases increased. Children went to bed hungry. Some families survived by eating garbage. In rural areas, people hunted and foraged for food like their ancestors had done centuries earlier. Homelessness exploded. Millions couldn't afford rent or mortgage payments. Shantytowns sprang up in every city, mockingly called Hoovervilles after the president. Families lived in shacks made from scrap wood, cardboard, and metal. These communities had no running water, no electricity, no sanitation. Disease spread easily. The Dust Bowl made things worse. Years of poor agricultural practices had depleted topsoil across the Great Plains. When severe drought struck in the early 1930s, the topsoil simply blew away. Massive dust storms darkened skies across the Midwest. Crops failed completely. Hundreds of thousands of farm families abandoned their land and migrated west, hoping to find work in California. These Okies faced hostility in California. Local residents viewed them as unwanted competition for scarce jobs. Migrant camps offered only marginally better conditions than Hoovervilles. Families lived in tents or cars. Children grew up without education or health care. The American dream had become a nightmare. Yet even in this darkness, communities found ways to support each other. Neighbors shared what little they had. Urban gardens provided some food. Barter systems emerged where money was scarce. People discovered that human connection mattered more than material wealth. These lessons would shape an entire generation's values. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the 1932 presidential election in a landslide. He promised a New Deal for the American people. What exactly that meant remained unclear. Roosevelt himself admitted he would try different approaches and keep what worked. His first 100 days in office brought a whirlwind of activity. Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, closing all banks temporarily. Government inspectors examined each institution's books. Only solvent banks were allowed to reopen. This simple act restored confidence. When banks reopened, depositors generally left their money in place. The banking panic ended almost immediately. Roosevelt took America off the gold standard. This was controversial but necessary. The gold standard required maintaining a fixed exchange rate between dollars and gold. This severely limited the government's ability to increase the money supply. By abandoning gold, Roosevelt freed the Federal Reserve to pursue expansionary monetary policy. The money supply began growing again. Prices stopped falling. The deflationary spiral reversed. This was probably the single most important policy change of the early New Deal. Yet it barely gets mentioned in most textbooks. Roosevelt also launched a series of relief and recovery programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men on environmental projects. The Works Progress Administration hired workers to build infrastructure. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to the rural South. These programs provided both immediate relief and long-term benefits. Critics called this socialism. Defenders called it pragmatism. The truth is more complex. Roosevelt wasn't trying to overthrow capitalism. He was trying to save it. He believed that unregulated capitalism had failed and that moderate government intervention was necessary to prevent revolution. And revolution seemed possible. Communist and fascist movements were gaining followers across America. Demagogues offered simple solutions to complex problems. Roosevelt understood that democracy itself was at stake. The New Deal was designed to show that democratic capitalism could address economic crisis without abandoning either democracy or capitalism. Some New Deal programs worked. Some failed. The National Recovery Administration attempted to stabilize prices and wages through industry-wide codes. This was eventually ruled unconstitutional and probably didn't work anyway. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration paid farmers to reduce production, raising food prices while millions went hungry. The optics were terrible even if the economics made some sense. But other programs had lasting impact. Social Security created a safety net for the elderly. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation ended bank runs by guaranteeing deposits. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulated stock markets to prevent another speculative bubble. Labor laws established minimum wages and maximum hours. These reforms fundamentally changed American capitalism. Yet the New Deal didn't end the Depression. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s. In 1937, a premature attempt to balance the budget triggered another severe recession. By 1939, 10 years after the crash, unemployment still exceeded 17%. The Depression finally ended not because of the New Deal, but because of World War II. World War II transformed the American economy overnight. Suddenly, unemployment wasn't a problem. Labor shortages were. Factories that had sat idle for years now operated around the clock. Production increased dramatically. Government spending soared. And none of the predicted disasters occurred. Classical economic theory suggested that massive government spending would cause inflation, crowd out private investment, and burden future generations with debt. None of this happened during the war. Instead, the economy grew faster than ever before. Unemployment fell below 2%. Wages increased. Living standards improved despite wartime rationing. This revealed something important. The Depression hadn't been caused by lack of resources or productive capacity. Those had existed throughout the 1930s. Factories stood idle. Workers wanted jobs. Raw materials were available. What was missing was sufficient demand and proper organization. The war provided both. Government spending created enormous demand. War planning organized production efficiently. The government financed spending through a combination of taxes, bonds, and monetary expansion. And it worked remarkably well. This suggested that the suffering of the 1930s had been unnecessary. The economy could have been mobilized for peacetime production just as effectively as it was mobilized for war. The barriers were political and ideological, not economic. Society could have built schools, hospitals, housing, and infrastructure instead of tanks and bombers. But it took the existential threat of war to overcome political resistance to government spending. After the war, many economists feared the Depression would return when military spending ended. They were wrong again. Instead, America entered an unprecedented period of prosperity. Several factors contributed to this. Wartime savings provided purchasing power. Pent-up demand for consumer goods was enormous. The GI Bill funded education and housing for returning veterans. And importantly, government policy had fundamentally changed. The Employment Act of 1946 committed the federal government to maintaining full employment. This represented a revolutionary change in thinking. Before the Depression, the government's economic role was minimal. After the war, everyone accepted that government must actively manage the economy to prevent future depressions. The post-war era also saw the creation of the modern welfare state. Social Security expanded. Unemployment insurance became standard. Healthcare benefits increased. Labor unions reached peak membership and negotiating power. The result was widely shared prosperity. Income inequality declined. The middle class expanded dramatically. The period from 1945 to 1973 saw the strongest and most equitable economic growth in American history. This was the world built on lessons learned from the Great Depression. A world where government played an active role in economic stabilization, where regulations prevented financial excess, where social safety nets protected vulnerable populations. a world that seems increasingly distant from our own. The conventional wisdom is that we learned from the Great Depression. Modern central banks understand the importance of maintaining the money supply. Deposit insurance prevents bank runs. Automatic stabilizers like unemployment insurance cushion economic downturns. Another Great Depression is impossible. But is it really? Consider the parallels. Income inequality today exceeds 1929 levels. The wealthiest 1% now own a larger share of national wealth than they did before the crash. Once again, the economy depends on continued asset price appreciation rather than sustainable wage growth and consumer spending. The financial system has become increasingly complex and interconnected. The 2008 financial crisis revealed how little regulators understood about modern finance. Credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, and shadow banking created vulnerabilities that nobody fully comprehended until they caused catastrophe. We narrowly avoided another Great Depression in 2008 only because policymakers remembered the 1930s. The Federal Reserve aggressively cut interest rates and expanded the money supply. The government bailed out major financial institutions. Stimulus spending prevented deeper collapse. These policies were controversial but probably necessary. Yet the recovery from 2008 was historically weak. Unemployment remained elevated for years. Wage growth stagnated. Many communities never fully recovered. And the policy response created new problems, particularly asset price inflation, that further increased inequality. International cooperation has weakened. Trade tensions are rising. The global financial system remains fragile. Political polarization has increased dramatically. Trust in institutions has eroded. These were all features of the 1920s and 1930s as well. Most concerning, we seem to have forgotten the political lessons of the Depression. Economic crisis breeds political extremism. When mainstream institutions fail to address widespread suffering, people turn to demagogues offering simple solutions. Democracy itself becomes vulnerable. The rise of fascism in Europe during the 1930s wasn't inevitable. It resulted from economic crisis combined with political dysfunction. Countries that responded effectively to the Depression, like Sweden and the United States, preserved democracy. Countries that failed to respond, or responded too slowly, often descended into authoritarianism. We face similar choices today. Climate change, technological disruption, and demographic shifts are creating enormous economic challenges. How we respond will determine not just our economic future, but our political future as well. So what should we learn from the Great Depression? First, economic systems are fragile. Prosperity is not self-sustaining. It requires proper institutions, regulations, and policies. Laissez-faire capitalism, left to its own devices, tends toward instability, inequality, and periodic crisis. Second, monetary policy matters immensely. The Federal Reserve's failures in the 1930s turned a serious recession into the Great Depression. Modern central banks have learned this lesson. The aggressive monetary response to 2008 and 2020 prevented similar catastrophes. Third, fiscal policy matters too. Government spending can compensate for collapsed private spending during economic crisis. Balanced budget fundamentalism during a depression is economically illiterate and morally inexcusable. The economy is not like a household budget. Fourth, financial regulation is necessary. Left unregulated, financial markets inevitably produce speculative bubbles that threaten the entire economy. The regulations established after the Great Depression prevented major financial crises for nearly 80 years. Their gradual erosion helped cause 2008. Fifth, inequality is economically dangerous. Extreme concentration of wealth reduces consumer demand and increases economic instability. It also creates political instability by fostering resentment and enabling populist demagogues. Sixth, international cooperation is essential. The Depression spread globally because countries pursued beggar-thy-neighbor policies. Competitive devaluations and retaliatory tariffs deepened the crisis for everyone. Economic nationalism is self-defeating in an interconnected world. Seventh, social safety nets serve economic purposes. Unemployment insurance and Social Security don't just help individuals. They automatically stabilize the economy by maintaining spending during downturns. They're economic infrastructure, not just charity. Eighth, democracy requires economic security. People won't support democratic institutions if those institutions fail to provide basic economic security. The appeal of authoritarianism grows when mainstream politics seems unable to address economic distress. Ninth, ideology must yield to evidence. The Depression persisted partly because policymakers clung to economic theories contradicted by reality. Admitting mistakes and changing course is essential. Ideological rigidity kills. 10th, prevention is better than cure. The Depression didn't have to happen. Better policies in the 1920s could have prevented or mitigated the crisis. Similarly, many future crises are preventable if we're willing to act on warning signs. The Great Depression revealed an uncomfortable truth. Economic catastrophe isn't some natural disaster beyond human control. It results from human choices, policy failures, ideological blindness, political dysfunction, institutional inadequacy. The suffering of the 1930s was preventable. The factories existed. The raw materials existed. The workers existed. What was missing was the wisdom to organize these resources productively and the political will to challenge orthodox assumptions. We face similar challenges today. Our economic system contains similar vulnerabilities: income inequality, financial fragility, international tensions, political polarization, climate crisis. We have the resources and technology to address these challenges. What we lack is collective wisdom and political courage. The Great Depression should teach us humility. Our economic systems are human constructs, fallible and imperfect. They require constant maintenance and periodic reform. Complacency leads to catastrophe. It should also teach us urgency. Once economic crisis begins, it develops its own momentum. Unemployment reduces spending, which increases unemployment. Bank failures reduce lending, which causes more bank failures. Downward spirals are hard to reverse. Prevention is vastly easier than cure. Most importantly, it should teach us responsibility. We cannot blame economic crisis on invisible market forces or inevitable historical processes. We create the institutions that govern our economic life. When those institutions fail, we bear responsibility. And we have the power to do better. The question is whether we will. Whether we'll learn from history or repeat it. Whether we'll make the hard choices necessary to build a more stable, equitable, and sustainable economic system. Or whether we'll sleepwalk toward another catastrophe, ignoring warning signs and trusting in obsolete assumptions. The Great Depression happened because people thought it couldn't happen. They believed prosperity was permanent. They dismissed warnings. They clung to comfortable myths. They failed to act until catastrophe forced their hand. We know better now, or at least we should. The question is what we'll do with that knowledge. The answer will determine whether future generations study our era as a time of wisdom and reform, or as another cautionary tale of preventable catastrophe. The choice, as always, is ours. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And right now, the rhymes are becoming uncomfortably familiar.